never-ending feedback mechanism. And that's why when I think of good chefs versus bad chefs, I view government officials, no matter what party they're from, they're probably not the best chef because they don't have a feedback mechanism. Whereas in the private economy, and those are famous American entrepreneurs, on the other side, in the private economy, again, they're constantly being bombarded with feedback mechanisms, profit and loss from the private sector. So we should cherish entrepreneurs. We don't have to think they always make good decisions. For every successful entrepreneur, there are probably 10 that fail. But again, that feedback mechanism of a market economy is incredibly important to get good growth. So now let's actually talk about growth. We know capital and labor are these two ingredients. We want to mix them well. We know entrepreneurs do that job, play that role. But what are the policies? What can government do to facilitate entrepreneurship and better economic growth? Well, I always look to the index of the Economic Freedom of the World Index published by the Fraser Institute in cooperation with many other think tanks around the world. And they list 5 big categories that you should look at when grading a country's policy: rule of law and property rights, monetary policy, fiscal policy, trade, and regulation. And the good news for Europe, and the good news for Denmark, for that matter, is that you have very, very good scores all across Europe for rule of law and property rights, monetary policy, and trade. The scores aren't quite so good for regulation, but the real problem that you find in Europe, when you look at the grades of the various European countries, the real problem is fiscal policy. And that's even true of Denmark. You look at Denmark's scores, very high, number 12. Out of 152 countries in the world, you're 12th for both monetary policy and trade. You also do pretty good on property rights. I mean, 13, that's actually a very, very good score. You're in effect getting an A. Regulation, maybe getting a B, but look at fiscal policy, 111 out of 152. You're beating Sweden. We talked in Sweden yesterday, looked at these same numbers, and the Swedes were 120. So 111 is better than 120, but there's still some progress that could be made in terms of not only Denmark, but Europe as a whole. And let me just talk a little bit about tax policy to set the stage, and then I'll sit down and have a broader discussion. Here's what I think is one of the problems with tax policy in all OECD countries. You have penalties on income that is saved and invested. I mentioned before, all economists agree that capital formation and labor supply are critical. Those are the 2 factors of production. How do we treat capital in Western nations? Well, at least these numbers are specific for the US. Between the capital gains tax, the corporate income tax, the double tax on dividends, and the death tax, in the US, you tax income that's saved and invested as many as 4 times. But income that you consume is by and large left alone. And even if we put a VAT in here, it would also be here. So a VAT doesn't change this bias against capital formation. So we have a very heavy bias against capital formation in most Western countries. And why is that a bad idea? Think about it, you have an apple orchard. What's the smart way to harvest apples? Do you pick them from the tree or do you chop down the tree? If you are taxing capital, you are chopping down the tree. The apples are the income and the tree is the capital. I had an intern at Cato who knew how to draw, so he actually did it more accurately. Do you want to pick the apples or do you want to saw off the branches? Because usually governments don't confiscate all capital, but they confiscate some of it every single year. That's a mistake. And so when I think about these tax policy decisions, it doesn't make sense from the perspective of the private sector, but sometimes it doesn't even make sense from the perspective of government. We've all heard about the Laffer curve. There's a big debate among economists. You ask 5 economists where the revenue maximizing point is, you'll get 9 answers. But we all agree on a couple of things. At a 100% tax rate, you're not going to get much money. At a 0% tax rate, you're not going to get much money. So really, the debate is just about the size of the curve. But I want to go ahead and close with some numbers, historical numbers from the 1980s in the US, because class warfare tax issues, you see that they're very big in the British election that's about to take place. They're very big in the context of the American debate, and I'm sure they're very big in a lot of European countries. So let's go back and look at some history. In 1980, when Reagan was elected, we had a top tax rate on households of 70% in America. And in that year, and these numbers, by the way, are all from the IRS Annual Statistics of Income Bulletin. In 1980, we had about 117,000 rich people, defined as $200,000 or above. They reported $36 billion of income to the IRS. and the federal government collected $19 billion of tax. Now remember, that's where the top tax rate is 70%. Reagan brought the top tax rate all the way down to 28%. And a lot of critics said that's not fair. Rich people won't pay enough. The government will be starved of revenue. Well, what actually happened? Let's look at the IRS numbers for 1988. We had a lot more rich people, a lot more taxable income, and the government collected 5 times as much revenue at a 28% top rate as it did at a 70% top rate. So that's not just the Laffer curve, that's the Laffer curve on steroids. So whether or not we're simply talking about top income tax rates, whether we're talking about punitive tax bias against savings and investment, these are the things that I think are causing problems for Western nations. And of course, why do we have bad tax policy? Because government's too big. Richard Rahn, my colleague at Cato, is famous for many things, but one of the things he's famous for is creating the Rahn curve, which is sort of the spending version of the Laffer curve. It points out when government is non-existent and nobody's providing protection for the rule of law and property rights, you don't have a very strong economy. But when government provides core public goods, that's good for growth, but then when government gets too big, there's a negative relationship between the size of government and economic performance. And there's lots of data out there where economists have studied this Rahn curve, and for the most part, the studies say that government should be no bigger than 20% of GDP. Now, in Denmark, you're close to 50%. We're about 37% in the US. We were 32% when Bill Clinton left office, so we've moved in the wrong direction as well. And all of us, because of our aging populations and falling birth rates, the fiscal pressure of government's going to get even bigger. So government's already too big in all our countries, and it's going to get worse. And you know what's sad? Government used to be very, very small. Here's a study from the former head of the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department. Back in 1870, government in Western nations, at least the ones that had data, was only about 10% of GDP. Even as late as 1913, it was only 12% of GDP. So that's really it for my presentation. I do make the central point that good fiscal policy should be defined as having the government grow slower than the private sector. That long-run trend line is critical. Greece got in trouble because the trend line was upside down. Government kept growing faster than the private sector. What's the private sector? It's your tax base. If government's growing faster than your tax base, then no amount of tax increases is like a dog chasing its tail. It's never going to work. You have to control government. And these two cartoons will be how I'll stop. I don't want to cut myself off. This is how the welfare state begins. Lots and lots of taxpayers helping a few genuinely needy people. That's how Social Security started in the US, that's how Medicare started, that's how Medicaid started. Every politician everywhere always says this will work because a lot of people will chip in a little bit of money to help a handful of hard luck cases. What happens over time, though, is that the ratio of people in the wagon and pulling the wagon reverses. And I understand that you have something called the party boat here in Denmark that's famous. Well, we call it riding in the wagon in the US, and that's the problem. When you have too many people on government dependency and not enough taxpayers pulling the wagon, and this is a picture of our changing demographics as well as an erosion of social capital, the belief in self-reliance, this is what concerns me in the long run about Western society. So economic growth is important, but it's going to be very, very difficult to get economic growth if we don't figure out how to constrain the fiscal burden of government, because Europe's doing okay on the other areas. It's the fiscal policy that's the challenge. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. I guess that's one of the differences between the US and Denmark, that we have a long coastline. So we have the party boat, and you have the frontier and the wagon. Just a quick question. The changes in the US tax rules did not just involve a cut in the marginal tax rate. They did expand the tax base as well, didn't they? So in one sense, it's not the Laffer curve at work alone. There's other stuff going on.
Reagan did two big things. In 1981, he had the across-the-board tax rate reductions, and so that didn't involve expanding the tax base. That was just a pure tax cut. Then in 1986, we had the Tax Reform Act, and what that did is it lowered rates further and then expanded the tax base. In some ways that I think were good, but in some ways that were bad because it expanded double taxation. So you get into this whole definition of do you have a consumption-based tax or what public finance economists call a Haig-Simons tax, and the Haig-Simons tax assumes you should double tax saving and investing and tax changes in net worth. So it gets into a very wonky, but nonetheless still very important discussion. So the 86 Tax Reform Act was good, but not nearly as good, I think, as the 81 tax cuts.
So how large a, how big a percentage of the expansion of the total taxes paid by the so-called rich is the Laffer curve, and how much is the expansion of the tax base?
Well, tax revenues from the rich, again, the numbers I was showing you were just for revenues from those making more than $200,000 a year, and they went up fivefold. Now, economists will argue forever how much of that was due to the Laffer curve. I mean, we did have 40% inflation during that period. We had 7 to 8% population growth. We had other economic reforms under Reagan that doubtlessly helped the economy grow and would have led to more rich people and more taxable income. So the bottom line is that I suspect it was a very strong example of the Laffer curve, but certainly you would not want to give the Laffer curve credit for all that. But think about rich people for a second. I think about how nice it would be to be one of them, but here's the thing to understand about rich people. At least in the U.S., the overwhelming share of their income is from business and investment sources. If you look at people making more than $10 million a year in the U.S., 81% of their income is from non-wage and salary sources. Now, what do we know about non-wage and salary income? You have tremendous control over the timing, level, and composition of that income. You can get on a computer in America, you can shift all your investments, just like that, to tax-free municipal bonds. So Barack Obama could raise the tax rate back up to 70%, but if a rich person moves all their investments into municipal bonds, guess what the federal government gets? Zero. So what happened or you can move all your investments into growth stocks. So you're not getting dividends, you're not getting any annual income, and the government can't tax unrealized capital gains. So once again, the government will get nothing. And so what happens with rich people, because they have this control over the level and composition of their income, they make changes in response to tax rates. And so it's futile, even if you think that rich people should be punished, and I don't, assuming you're not a crony capitalist getting favors from the government. But if you're an honest entrepreneur, I don't think you should be punished, but even if you do think that person should be punished, it's very futile and short-sighted to do it because they have so many simple, completely legal ways of changing their behavior in ways where their tax exposure shrinks or goes to zero.
Thank you very much, Dan. One piece of information. In Denmark, a government can tax unrealized capital gains. There you go.
Do not share that with the American tax authorities.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. We'll move to the panel, and let's do it this way. We'll get the panelists up one by one, and my introduction is going to be very, very brief. This is Denmark. We're very informal, some say impolite, but there you go. We have a lot of people who want to say something, so it'll be up. First person on the panel is Christian Bjørnskov, who's a professor of economics at Aarhus University. Please come up here. Our second panelist is, and I'm struggling with the names here, John Charalambakis. Was that good? Good. Please come up here. Chief economist at the Black Summit Financial Group Incorporated. The second is Richard Rahn, who's sitting there. Sorry, third panelist. Richard is your title senior fellow? I forgot.
Yeah.
Senior fellow at the Cato Institute. And our fourth panelist is Anders Krab Johansen, who is editor-in-chief at Børsen, the Danish version of Financial Times. And finally, we have, as an addition to the list, Mark Klugman, who was advisor to Ronald Reagan and 7 other...
Speechwriter to President Reagan.
Speechwriter, I guess that's pretty much the same thing, isn't it? You get some influence on what he says. And advisor to 7 other democratically elected presidents on how to introduce difficult reforms. So welcome to all of you, and you've been given 5 minutes, and I really need to emphasize that it's 5 minutes, please, because otherwise the time is going to get out of hand for us. to talk about today's topic, and we start out with Christian. Here you go.
5 minutes, okay. It's an unenviable task because I actually agree with everything Dan said.
Good man.
Yeah. so let me phrase it and look at it from another angle. We just had a crisis. And everyone celebrates right now that we're out of the crisis. But no one talks about what kind of growth we're coming back to after the crisis. So everyone says, great, Europe is doing fine because we're out of the crisis. We're out of the dark. But a lot of European countries, that is including Denmark, is coming back to the situation from before the crisis, which is anemic growth. Very, very slow growth. Denmark in particular. And I mean, if we're in Italy, it would be even worse, but fortunately we're not. Now, before the crisis, the 15 years before the crisis, Danish productivity grew at about half the rate as in Britain or in Sweden or Germany. So in the economic freedom indices, we look all right when you disregard the size of the public sector. But something else is going on, because we look roughly like Sweden does, except that we're not doing as well as Sweden. So my problem here is, how do we tell that story? Do people know? And I don't think they do. So I agree with everything Dan said, and you know what Dan said now, but the average Dane has no clue whatsoever. The average Dane is told the story that we are out of the crisis, everything's fine again. Now, how do you tell that story? Mark might be the expert here, of course, but I think the problem is that no Danish politician has the incentive to tell this story. What they talk about, and actually what I wrote in Anders' newspapers some time ago, is the entire debate in a country like Denmark, same goes for Sweden and a number of other countries, is that we need the public sector as a milk cow for the government. So we're concerned about the growth of productivity, the performance of the public sector, for one and only one reason. That if it doesn't grow, it can't finance a growing public sector. So as much as I agree with everything that Dan said, I'm concerned that this is not something that ordinary people or ordinary voters know. Because what they're told is mostly what's on the news, we're out of the crisis, and mostly what do politicians tell them. And someone like me, coming from a public choice point of view, always thinks as a first of all, politicians have really, really bad incentives. Their time horizon is right now about a couple of weeks, I guess, in Denmark, because the election is just around the corner. And at best, 4 years. So their interest is in telling people what might be fine for them in a couple of years, but not what are the problems down the line. What are the problems? Well, a lack of entrepreneurship. Nikolai Foss and I have in several publications shown that that is at least partly due to the size of the public sector in Denmark. So what we do in Denmark is that we try politically to encourage entrepreneurship while we damage it through the tax system, through transfers, and just through the sheer size of the government. We have the public sector as such, and then we have several layers of regulations. So my colleagues in the Productivity Commission discovered, while doing their job, something that doesn't show up in the economic freedom indices. Not just do we regulate an area, but how much do we regulate it? So what they discovered was several instances where politicians had regulated an area, then a couple of years later regulated the area because they didn't realize that they had regulated, and then a couple of years after they regulated again because they didn't know they had regulated twice. So what that creates is a problem, because even the politicians have no clue what they're doing. And the end result is...
Did you say even the politicians have no clue what they're doing? Did I hear you say that? Sorry, go, carry on.
Most academics have no clue either. So. But as I say it, as much as I agree with the main message here, my problem as an academic, as a columnist, and just a regular person who's concerned about what's going on, is how do we get that out to ordinary people in Denmark or the US or in Germany or in Greece for that matter? And I have no idea how to do that. But at least we're doing it today for a select audience. Thanks.
Part of which is on the internet, so it might not have to stay select. Thank you very much, Christian and John.
I would like to take my 5 minutes to take you through 100 slides. Do I have time? You can probably just select a couple of slides. Thank you. It's a great honor to be among you. The first slide I would like to talk about is some near-term troubles and the potential of a Grexit from the Eurozone. I don't think that we have been told the truth. Greece has borrowed 240 billion euros out of the EFSF, approximately 77 billion euros out of the ELA, the Emergency Liquidity Assistance, and approximately 91 billion euros in the Target 2. And nobody talks about Target 2. To get a picture of what Target 2 means, let's take a look at the balance sheet of Deutsche Bank. As you can see, Deutsche Bank's balance sheet, 60% is approximately Target 2. So imagine $91 billion being demanded out of Deutsche Bank on Monday morning, Monday the 11th. It's going to be shaken up. Target 2 is the most dangerous financial instrument the European financial system, the European Central Bank is using. It's 1.1 trillion euros and nobody talks about it. So if Greece defaults, expect major ramifications. Tremendous financial turmoil. It could be the Lehman Brothers event for Europe and possibly for the globe. Unfortunately, we believe that monetary policy can do everything. No. Monetary policy has reached its limits, both in the United States and in Europe. Certainly in Japan. So I think that we do need some radical free market reforms, primarily in Europe as well as in the United States, in order to kick growth again. Unless that happens, we might be destined to slow death. Death by 1,000 cats. Just to give you an indication how dangerous the near terms are, look at German absurd, completely absurd dividend, yields for 10-year bonds. 7 years out, they're negative. And certainly, we know historically, when the dividend yield on a stock exceeds the corporate bond yield, trouble is coming. Oh, here is the structural dysfunction of the European Union. We think it's deleveraging? Certainly not. I can say the US has been deleveraging, but certainly not the European Union. As far as the poor state of European banks, look at this. I am going to just mention the Texas ratio, which we all know is the non-performing loans of the bank divided by the equity of the bank. Whenever the Texas ratio exceeds 65%, the banks go belly up. In other words, goes bankrupt. That's why the Texas banks, savings and loan institutions, went belly up in the 1980s, because the Texas ratio exceeded 65%. Anybody wants to make a guess what's the BNP Paribas Texas ratio? It's 92%. How about unit credit in Italy? 96%. Santander, 107%. Deutsche Bank cannot be calculated, it's infinite. So the problems from country to country are different. In Spain, you may have real estate problems, or too much debt in the private sector. In Greece, you have too much debt in the government sector. Of course, my definition of the government is always inefficient, corrupt, and wasteful. And I, born and raised in Greece. The institutional makeup, of the Eurozone, it's schizophrenic. I think the best thing that the Europe has to do, and I know my time is coming up, is to go back to the basic principles of what is a free trade zone with free movement of capital, of money, of technology, some limited movement of people, of labor, and that's it. The Eurozone was an experiment that has failed and will continue failing us until they dissolve the Eurozone. I think I need to stop here.
We feel so much better now. Richard, do your worst.
Excuse me. Like John, I have good news and bad news. I have 30 slides, but I'll only show you 5 or 6 of them. Excuse me, which ones do I mark here? Okay. Okay. What we've had is a slowdown in real-world GDP growth. This is sort of optimistic. It comes from the IMF, which means it's wrong. Here, I'll just go back here one. But you can see we've had a big slowdown in economic growth around the world. And I agree with Dan and John. The situation is going to get worse. I'm just going to go through quickly to this. Each year, our Federal Reserve starts off with a forecast of saying economic growth for the next year is going to be about 4%. They've been doing this for 5 years. Each year it comes down to 2%. And now the administration was very concerned because the first quarter of this year, they just reported the data last week, was only 0.2%, 0.2%. And so the administration said, well, the reason economic growth was so slow was insufficient global warming. Actually, they didn't quite say it in those words. What they said, it was too cold. We had a major cold weather. But I think what they really meant was insufficient global warming. Here we've got Eurozone real GDP, and those are the official forecast numbers. And I'm willing to bet they're not going to be hit for many of the reasons that John and Dan were talking about. Exchange rate. You see the mess that we're in. Now think if you're an automobile manufacturer in Germany and you're trying to decide where to put your next plant. Do you put it in Germany or do you put it in the US when you've got these kinds of fluctuations in the currencies? I mean, just think if you're a planning manager, how do you do this? It's this kind of huge shifts in the value of our currencies is causing major uncertainty. The economies are not shifting like this. This is just currencies. For those of you who like a one world currency like the gold standard, this is part of your argument. Eurozone interest rates, they're even worse than the US. Now, negative interest. How many are receiving negative interest on your accounts right now? And I keep wondering why you just don't go in and get the bills in cash rather than putting them in the bank. The problem we have here, the whole idea of QE, the quantitative easing that we've done in the US, Japan, and here in Europe, is this has been a major theft from savers. Traditionally, people would get about 3% on their savings above the rate of inflation. So you have a 2% rate of inflation. The normal rate of return on the safest investments had been about 2.5% to 3%. So normally you expect 5%. Right now, savers are not getting anything. This is equivalent to an enormous tax on savers. And now, in theory, according to the central bankers. If you do this, then people should consume more rather than save more. And it's very interesting to look at Japan in particular, because it's been going on for quite a while. The Japanese households, they say, my gosh, I'm not getting anything in my savings. Rather than going out and consuming because they don't have a return on their savings, they're saving even more because they worry about their old age, because they know the government is not going to be there to bail them out. So savings even go up more, which means consumption goes down more, and you get on this kind of death spiral that we're all in at the moment. I think I'll just leave it there. I go through the various countries and so forth.
Okay. Thank you very much, Richard. Anders, you have a presentation?
Yes.
Feel free to stand if you like.
Okay, yeah.
We're moving closer to the first two presentations. This is really a supermodel. I like this front page and everything. Got really happy, and we thought, in the midst of a crisis, no, we are a supermodel. We know the way out of this crisis. Most people who actually read the story were quite surprised, because this is the story. Denmark is not really a supermodel, not even in a Nordic sense. These are the basic growth figures with an index of 100 back in '93. And Norway is a particular case. It's an oil state, but apart from that, the Nordic economies aren't doing very well, especially not Denmark. And then I saw this one, the Financial Times, which was kind of scary. They went back to 2006 and compared Denmark to countries that we should be able to compare with. And it shows an awful story for us. We're even worse than France. It's really bad. It's really bad. Sweden have had reforms. They had a financial crisis back in the early 1990s. And they have had continuous reforms until the current government, which has improved their economic performance massively. And the US is a special case. Germany have had their harsh reforms and all the other reforms. But Denmark in particular is a slow case. Again, if you think we have investments, well, not. We have outgoing investments. Denmark has become like a separate economy. Some companies in this country are doing extremely well. Novo Nordisk, AP Møller Mærsk, we have others. But they are global companies where they have just a headquarter in Denmark. It doesn't really mean anything to them anymore. They're based here. They were invented, most of them, 100 years ago. They are foundations or family-owned, most of them. Some of them are on the stock market. And they're performing really well. But global companies seem not to see this country. They seem to go elsewhere. I have 3 reasons. This is fast again. If you look at public consumption, it's 28.2%. We thought we were the world masters. We have been overtaken by Holland, the Netherlands. They're doing better than us, or worse, actually. On top of that, you have pension transfers and all the transfers. So that's one of the reasons. The public sector takes up a lot of the production. It's in health, schools, and other services. Another one, and that's back to Dan's first point. This is the number of people living off government money, either as being employed by the public sector or getting unemployment benefits. So if you look at the first one back in 1970, you see that the number of people working in the private sector is above 2 million. And now the population growth, it's a little below 4 million back then. A little below 5 million, and now it's about 5.5. And if you see the number of public employees or people on social benefits, it grows, and it's really difficult to stop. So that's another issue. Again, we've had 8 sectorial studies of Danish growth opportunities that the 2 latest governments have carried out. And they just went through the most basic business regulation. And those are the number of jobs. It's about 100,000 jobs you can create just by changing the regulation of the private sector. Basic regulation. You don't even let the private sector grow into the sectors that are now mostly public sector, like health and other issues. So it's just basic regulation. And if you ask Danish business leaders what are the major problems, we have tax rates, the availability of finance, tax regulation, inefficient public bureaucracy, and restrictive regulation of working conditions, and poor working ethics. So those are the major issues. And what to do? I mean, 3 easy ways, or difficult ways, but easy slogans. You move people from welfare to jobs. So the large proportion of the Danish population that are now on welfare, some type of welfare, in the age between 20 and 65, you move them into some type of job. That's the incentive structure. Then you change the public sector into private jobs. That is, again, in school, healthcare, childcare, and so forth. You can change those jobs. It's cleaning. It could even be companies like energy companies, transport companies like SAS, DSP, the other companies we have. And then you get people to work more. We have extremely restrictive regulation of work. We have collective agreements that are extremely strict. And we have, of course, the incentives on the tax rates. So there's stuff to work with. And finally, a commercial break. I've just produced a book. It's in Danish, so you have to Google Translate it for the rest of you. Well, maybe a few thousand people will read it. It's coming out on the 9th of June, and it's about these issues. The title is "We Will Win When We Wake Up." So that's basically the issue. All right, that's it.
Thanks, Anders. I look forward to reading the book. Mark?
Yes, very. Are we on?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. But my answer to your first question, how much of the Reagan tax revenue increases were from rate reductions and how much from the tax base, what I take from Dan's answer is 100% is the tax base if we put together the voluntary individuals, this choice of an individual to migrate income into the accounting rules that make it taxable, as opposed to migrating it into a space where it's not taxable. What you're adding on to that are changes in those accounting rules, which still leave it in the hands of individual decisions in most cases. On the other question about how do you produce reform, how do you sell reform, I think one of the basic insights that we've have is the problem defines the solution. That we usually try and sell our solutions before we have established the definition of the problem, and we usually permit a distinction between national problems and individual problems. If we want to win, it's essential that what people have defined individually as their problem is an introduction to our solution. And to increase that intensity around strongly felt personal problems until it gets to the point where there is a demand for a solution, then when executive power is in the hands of a reformer, it can be used to produce the necessary reforms. Now, the Scandinavian countries were a real problem for free market advocates in the United States for a few decades, because we wanted to explain why everything the Scandinavian countries were doing meant extreme poverty. And against all of our advice, life continued to be decent in the Nordic countries. Now, this little matrix is part of an answer to that which is of use in the developing world, which is where my work is. The one axis is, are you business friendly? The other is there rule of law? And it turns out that countries that don't have rule of law but start out at a low level, if they're business friendly, they can up to a point achieve very fast levels of economic growth. And countries that have rule of law but are not business friendly, like Great Britain in the 1970s, if they snap back into market-friendly, business-friendly rules, can achieve Thatcher levels of economic turnaround. The picture I want to use, I don't think we're going to have time to really go much into the Honduran model, so I'm going to use this picture, Helmut Kohl and Deng Xiaoping. Each of them faced a similar task. How do you migrate an economy from socialism to a market economy? One of them did it in such a way that today the former East Germany is a third poorer than the rest of Germany. The other one did in such a way that the zones created by Deng Xiaoping became the most dynamic economic spaces in the world. To humanize this, if you're a young person in the former East Germany looking for opportunity, you leave the area that was the target of Kohl's reforms. If you're a young person in the north of China looking for opportunity, you migrate to the place that was the target of Deng Xiaoping's reforms. Now, essentially, every conversation for 25 years in different countries with different governments about economic reforms, the unstated premise is the unit of our attention is an entire country, an entire economy. And our task is how do we become 51% so that the 49% who do not get it will yield to whatever change we hope to make. And this produces pendulum type of reform, or it means you need a Ronald Reagan, a man who's a great leader who arrives when there's a great crisis. Now, it presupposes that you're willing to get into a great crisis and that you'll have the good fortune to find a great leader when you do it that way. Deng Xiaoping, who'd been purged twice, came up with a different approach, which it's worth identifying and learning from. Most of the reforms we do are national unitary reforms. We presume that we have to change the rules across an entire country for our reforms to take hold. Deng Xiaoping made no such assumption. So we can say that Mao, in moving from a private economy to a socialist economy, addressed an entire country, and Kohl, moving from a socialist economy to a market economy, addressed a whole country. If you have good ideas, you do enormous good. If you have bad ideas, 5% of the population is killed in China. If you think about doing zones on an opt-in basis, if your ideas are good, such as the market reforms of China, not only do you not do any harm, but you have organic growth and it expands on a basis of low conflict. You don't force everyone who disagrees with you to be on the losing side so that you can be on the winning side. It's easier to do it that way. If you have really bad ideas, no one even remembers the utopian socialists. The kibbutz within the Israeli economy is an archaic, irrelevant, vestigial cultural artifact. They haven't really done harm because bad ideas on an opt-in voluntary zone basis simply don't matter very much. Now, I would just end with this. What happened to the class of 1980? Ronald Reagan, national unitary reform, a leader during a time of crisis. We thought this would define the next decades. It hasn't worked out that way. Deng Xiaoping, using opt-in zones based on self-selection, it produced and sustained for several decades and up to today the fastest growing economy in the world. To the degree that we set as a limiting factor our capacity to have effective reform, that it has to be across the entire country on top of all pre-existing interests and population, there's a natural limit, which is our ability to overcome the opposition of people who do not wish to have the rules changed in the area in which they are. To the degree that we're willing to open reform spaces, as Honduras is doing right now, our possibilities become the possibilities that exist under the reforms that have produced the fastest growing economy in the world in China. Thank you very much.
Thanks. There was a Danish politician, a businessman turned politician, who suggested that we needed lower taxes on one of the Danish islands. That did not go down well in Denmark, but maybe he was in front of his, maybe he was a pioneer.
It has a lot to do with how it's framed. The key is to define what is start with a problem that everyone, Klugman's law, it's easier to produce a consensus around a problem than an agreement about a solution. Before you provide any suggestion about a solution, produce the consensus around the problem. And when everyone wants to solve a problem, because we all agree on what the problem is, then your solution becomes viable.
Yes. I wish I had a law. Okay, let's turn to the floor. And while you think about which questions you'd like to ask, I'll just ask the panelists if anyone, apart from yourself, said makes you want to comment. Anyone? Yes. Oh, you have the mic. Sorry.
Avoid trying to convince people and then just make like test areas in a country or test scenarios? Or should you try to convince people?
Happily, these are not mutually exclusive. That is, if you have two tools in your toolbox, sometimes one of them is the most applicable, but often both of them can each be doing their jobs. Did you ever see the movie When Harry Met Sally? There's this wonderful scene in the delicatessen, and there's an old lady at a nearby table, and she looks over and says, "I'll have what she's having." The beauty of actually bringing into existence something that's real, like the special economic zone in Shenzhen, China, is instead of getting into an ideological debate inside the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party that they should renounce their ideas and their legitimizing principles, you simply begin to produce other provincial leaders in China who, like Harry Met Sally, say, "I want what she's having." You convince people with their eyes more quickly than with their ears.
It's similar to your point concerning tax competition, isn't it, Dan? Right, we have a question here, and please present yourself, and please do not make a speech, ask a short and precise question.
I'll try that. Can you hear me? I am a Christian humanity, and that is, by the way, my name too. I have a dream that I would like to invite you in the panel, and also any guests here, and also any viewers on the internet, to consider if this dream might be attractive for you to join. Are you ready?
A short and precise dream.
The dream is that the United Nations and the World Bank creates a world citizen account for every 7.3 billion world citizen continuously receiving $1 a day. Thank you.
Okay, was it for anyone in particular?
Yes, it was for the 7.3.
The question.
The question was for the panel.
Okay, so anyone in the panel. We'll take, we don't have that much time, so we'll take a couple of questions. We have another one here. There you go.
Hello? Yes. Hi, is it on? Yeah, sweet. I'll stand up, it's easier. My name's Edward Anderson. I'm on exchange here at Copenhagen University from Britain, where we've obviously got an election in 2 days' time. My question is to, I'm going to get the name off, Christian, the professor. You talked about public choice theory in politics obviously leading to short-term decision-making, but can't we see that same behaviour in the private sector? So if we go to Britain, Tesco made a significant amount of money and then their share price collapsed precisely because the people in charge of the business have zero interest in making sure it works 20, 30 years down the line. They only care about the next 2 or 3 years. Or another example is CityLink, which was doing fine for the people who were the directors and then went bust overnight, putting everyone out of work. So I accept and I agree with your comment that you have a dangerous problem with short-termism, but how do you solve that not just for the public sector, but also in the private sector?
Well, I think we'll start with those two. Does anyone want to comment on the idea of paying everyone $1 a day? Richard?
I have a dream, and it's I have a dream that's called Abolish the World Bank, because it's been a huge engine for economic destruction. It's misallocated resources and has been endlessly corrupt. And as Lord Bauer used to say, foreign aid, in particular the World Bank, is a mechanism for taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. We do not need governmental mechanisms to do this. We take a look of we've had the slides up there of Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea. We've been doing a film, Chile, here in Europe, Estonia, Switzerland. These are places which have been dynamic. They've created wealth for all their citizens, greatly raised standards of living, and they've done it without government aid. Governments are a curse to prosperity, not a help.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, let's take the short-termism of...
Right, let me just say, Richard actually already quoted Peter Bauer. I wanted to do that too.
Feel free to do that.
But the problem is that independent research shows that foreign aid doesn't work. It has zero effect when you look at economic growth, poverty, and so on. But what it does, it rewards really bad governments. So what the suggestion might be is it looks nice, it feels good, but it's going to be rewarding some of the worst politicians in the world. Now, the Tesco thing. I agree. We do see short-termism in the private sector, but then those companies either discover what they're doing or they go bankrupt, and then we don't shop at Tesco's, we shop at Sainsbury's or whatever. But our politicians don't see the consequences. That's a difference. In the private sector, with a free economy, a company that does something stupid faces the consequences itself. In politics, politicians can completely disregard the consequences.
And in fact, in many cases, if there's a problem, they try to solve it by putting more resources into the institutions doing badly.
Yeah,
I think opposite of what markets do.
I think Mark, one way of saying what Mark said is that, well, a lot of people don't find a consensus about the solutions, but there's a consensus about there's no consensus about the problem, but there's a consensus about the solution, government.
Mark, you had a comment on, was that the $1 a day thing?
Well, I've spent over 2 decades now living and working in developing countries in Latin America, and your dream is not their dream. What they want is what you have, not what you're offering. What they want is a job, what they want is rule of law, what they want is a productive, predominantly private economy. 50,000 people a year, where I'm living and working now, Honduras, risk their lives climbing aboard a train. If their grip should slip as they try and get illegally into the United States, they may fall under the train. They try again, having lost a leg, not because they're looking for $1 a day from the UN or the World Bank. They want a job. They want to live and work in the decency that's taken for granted in a place like Denmark.
Dan?
On the issue of about the UK, and it's not only that a business will go bankrupt if it doesn't serve its customers, but in theory, what you described as the principal agent problem, the directors, the officers of the company, not actually looking out for the interests of shareholders. Well, this is where I get so worried that some countries, like the United States, have anti-takeover laws specifically to entrench and empower existing management over the shareholder. So if we have a very active market for corporate control, as the phrase goes in the U.S., that's going to make sure that the shareholders have some ability to discipline and get rid of managers who aren't focusing on the long-term share value of the company, which of course is tied to the long-term profits of the company, not short-term quarter-to-quarter profits.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions. We have one down here. Please present yourself.
My name is Suresh. I'm a policy advisor. This is a question of a moral dilemma. Now you have this invisible industry, that's what I call the financial industry. You never see the money, but they're still there. But now what we have done during the crisis is that we have, during boom time, we have privatized profits. And when we went bust, we have socialized losses. How can you say that you can't have big governments when you have the industry itself has advocated to do this? Can you see the dichotomy there? And that really puzzles many people.
It does indeed. And another one?
Yeah, hi, Stephen Engberg. I've been an entrepreneur for many years. Back to the issue, I think one thing that's particularly noisy in everything you're saying is what you're not saying. About 25 years ago, there was this thing invented called the internet, which has been changing the economy rapidly, and not one of you have been mentioning it. I think one crucial issue which you're forgetting here is that maybe regulation or government control of the economy has bad impact on the economy. But the really bad kind of regulation is when you put it into digital control. That's when you exercise power, and centralist power on a scale we have never seen before. And not one of you have mentioned it.
One very brief example of what you're talking about.
Well, for instance, Denmark, you have this nice little institution called NemID. It means that everything you can do in Denmark has to be going through one single gatekeeper, controlling everything what's going on. Where's the smart thing about that? Why don't we digitize so we decentralize? We distribute control. Instead, we centralize control in the hands of very, very few entities. Not only in government and in infrastructure, but also get the Googles and the Facebooks. I think this is because of the way we design technology. And we fail to define the requirements to digital design.
Okay. Was that to both questions to all of the panel? Is that correct? Okay, so who feels like having a go at this? Okay, there are several people. I think you go first, Anders.
As for the digital one, I think what lies behind the current development is, of course, the internet and global transportation. And I think that will change the way governments need to act if they want their country to be prosperous. So that's pro-market, that's more market. What you're talking about is how to structure the digitalization, and you have either government agencies or you have private companies. On that part, I really don't have an answer. It could be Google, it could be Facebook, or it could be NED, as you mentioned, as the Danish one. But you ask for someone to regulate that before it regulates itself, and I'm not sure how to do that.
Richard, you...
I want to make a comment on the first gentleman who talked about the crony capitalist, which is an enormous problem. It's always been with us, and businessmen try to use government for their own purposes. Adam Smith wrote a lot about that, of how when tradesmen get together, it's usually not for the good of the public. Back today, there's my weekly syndicated columns on the Hanseatic League, and it was crony capitalism back then. In the 1980s, I was the chief economist of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the world's largest business federation. And there was always a struggle within the chamber between the entrepreneur and small businessmen and a lot of the big companies. And by my basic nature, I allied myself with many of the entrepreneurs, the smaller companies. Many of the big businesses, like the folks from General Electric, they did not like me because I was arguing against their special privileges that they had lobbied for. And this is just the nature of the way things are. So all of us who actually believe in markets, believe in economic opportunity, believe in economic growth, we have to be that offsetting influence. And things like these, our think tanks, the kind of fact that your group's here, that is the offset, the countervailing power. And it's a never-ending struggle. It's gone on since mankind first started developing markets.
Okay. Dan?
I don't have the mic.
Yes.
A former executive of a company in the United States famously said that capitalism without bankruptcy is like religion without hell. And I think that applies to the TARP bailouts and the cronyism that we saw in the United States. We should have allowed the banks that were insolvent to go under, just like we did with the savings and loans back in the late 1980s, early 1990s that John was talking about. We would have had to put taxpayer money in to recapitalize, basically to pay off the account holders. So it's not like we would have saved money in terms of tax dollars, but we would have allowed the business people, the bondholders, the shareholders, the executives at those big institutions, they touched a hot stove, they should burn their fingers.
Can I just add one thing here? Yep. We also need to allow governments to go bankrupt. Things don't disappear. I mean, the good things when bankruptcy, not all the buildings fall down or anything, but it's a way of cleaning up the balance sheets. And I'd like maybe John to comment on this. I think the IMF and the other multinational governments have done a great disservice to Greece. If Greece had gone into bankruptcy some previous point, it would have had to clean up the public finances because people wouldn't loan them money. And now we just drag out the agony. And every week, is this going to be the week that Greece goes under? And it drags on how many years? And it's the same thing. We had the same problem in Detroit and a number of areas. The city of Chicago was in danger and others. We had to let them go bankrupt. It's a signal to bondholders, don't buy bad debt.
You want to comment on that, John? I believe Greece has a proud tradition of going
Certainly,
bankrupt.
Greece should have gone bankrupt in 2010. By prolonging the debt, you just make it more painful for everybody who's involved.
That's a very clear and short answer. And you had a comment as well, Mark?
Yeah, I think the phrase crony capitalism is false and lethal. It's anti-capitalism, cronyism. It's an attempt to escape from the realities of the marketplace. In Dan's example of entrepreneurs, it's about not an entrepreneur-driven economy. Ronald Reagan didn't celebrate big business. He celebrated the role of the entrepreneur. What Richard says about bankruptcy. The cronyism is to deny the realities of capitalism and to use political influence. It is a form of socialism. It's profit-driven socialism. And I think it's a terrible mistake to surrender critical ideological terrain on language. For example, what has it meant in the history of Europe that a political phenomenon known as National Socialism is not regarded as a variant of socialism? And it somehow gets bundled over where the socialists claim themselves as being the preeminent opponents of National Socialism historically. There are costs on these mistakes of misinterpretation where someone else's errors become our burden incorrectly and needlessly.
Okay, any more comments on the centralization internet question? I was thinking maybe when we talk about regulation, we need to be very clear. There are some types of regulation, government regulation, that free marketeers believe in. Private property is regulation, and enforcing contracts is regulation. So I guess we need pro-market regulation. What would pro-market regulation look like on the internet? Any take on that? I think Christian.
Let me just take to the example of Google. So the EU has opened a case against Google. Just remind you of two things. First of all, the fact that there is such a large and such a profitable company in a market is a sure signal that there are money to be made by other companies moving in and destroying Google's monopoly status. Secondly, I'd urge you to watch Blade Runner. To move from 1982, the production design is great, and they made sure, as much as they could, that the advertisement, the big billboards in Blade Runner were from companies that they were sure would survive for many years. Have a look at that movie and see how many companies you recognize that actually survived. I think there were two.
Richard, have a go.
Well, you pointed out, government's sole role is protection of private property and establishing the basic rule of law. You know, we're not allowing deception, misrepresentation. You can almost go back to the Ten Commandments. That's really enough. And you think about sports leagues, football league. If we change the rules every week or every month or before every game in the way that government changes the rules for the business community, you would have enormous problems. The leagues could not continue to exist. And we all think about Google and say, well, Google is natural monopoly. I'm old enough, so the first course in antitrust I took, the big fear was that General Motors would monopolize the automobile market, that IBM would monopolize the computer market, and that U.S. Steel, a company most of you have never heard of, would monopolize the world steel market. And of course, we look what happened to all three of these firms. I guess U.S. Steel at one point actually did go bankrupt. General Motors basically went bankrupt, and IBM certainly flirted with it. And I don't know who's going to replace Google, but I bet 10, 15, 20 years from now, Google is going to be also back in the pack. Things will come along we can't envision. And the idea that somehow people in government can see in the future of who's going to monopolize this just never happens.
Okay, thanks. We have to finish up now.